There are mornings when you wake up, and before your feet even touch the floor, the weight of the day has already arrived. The alarm rings. The bills wait. The list of calls and tasks runs through your mind. You move quickly because you feel like you must. Somewhere along the way, life turned into a long checklist, and you are expected to carry it without pause. I remember those years clearly. Work was a ladder I had to climb. Every step was serious. Every mistake felt like failure. At home, responsibilities piled higher. The house, the children, the endless cycle of payments and promises. Even when I was with people I loved, my mind was elsewhere, planning the next move, worrying about what I had not yet done. Have you ever felt that way? As if life is one continuous rehearsal, but the real performance never comes. We prepare. We struggle. We sacrifice. Always waiting for the moment when everything will finally feel complete. Yet when that moment arrives, it passes, and the next demand is already waiting. That was how I lived for a long time. I thought seriousness was the key to success. If I carried life like a heavy stone, maybe it would prove I was strong. If I treated every task as life or death, maybe I would never fall behind. But the truth is that seriousness was not strength. It was weight. It pressed down on my chest until even simple joys felt unreachable. One afternoon, I left the office late. The sun had nearly set. On the way home, I noticed children playing in the street. They were chasing each other, laughing without care. For a moment, I stopped. I realized that none of them were thinking about tomorrow, or the bills, or the tasks waiting. They were simply there, running, laughing, alive. It struck me then, somewhere along the road, I had forgotten how to play. I began to wonder, what if life was not meant to be carried like a burden? What if it was more like a song? We do not listen to a song only for the last note. We listen to enjoy the melody, the harmony, the rise and fall. What if life is the same? What if its value is not in the destination, but in the living of it? This thought would not leave me. It followed me through quiet nights, through early mornings with a cup of coffee in my hand. I would look out the window at the trees swaying in the wind. I noticed how they moved freely, not with purpose, not with seriousness, but with ease. The wind blew, and they danced. Nature does not take itself too seriously. The ocean does not apologize for its waves. The stars do not worry about shining too brightly. The birds do not question their songs. They simply exist, fully and without hesitation. I started to ask myself, why do we humans make it all so heavy? Why do we carry life like a punishment, instead of moving with it like a dance? The more I looked, the clearer it became. Seriousness is not the same as depth. Being light does not mean being shallow. Joy is not weakness. Sometimes the deepest wisdom is found in laughter, in presence, in the moments when we stop chasing and simply notice what is already here. I remember sitting at my kitchen table late one evening. The house was quiet. For once, there was no television, no phone in my hand, no work papers spread out in front of me, just silence. At first, the silence felt strange, almost uncomfortable. But as I sat there, I realized the silence was not empty. It was full of the sound of my own breath, full of the chance to feel the chair beneath me, the warmth of the lamp, the steady rhythm of my heart. That was when I understood. Life had been offering me these moments all along, but I had been too serious to see them. I thought life demanded control, when in truth, it had been inviting me to let go. We live in a culture that rewards seriousness. Promotions go to those who work longer hours. Respect is given to those who appear busy, exhausted, and worn. We are told that slowing down is lazy, that joy is childish, that play is for the young. And so we push forward, frowning, grinding. I'm convinced this is the only way. But ask yourself this. When you look back at your life, will the proudest memories be the hours you stayed late at the office? The endless lists completed? The seriousness you carried? Or will they be the laughter around a dinner table? The road trips with no destination? On the simple afternoons, when you felt free enough to just be? For me, The answer became clear. I had spent too long chasing seriousness, and it left me empty. What I needed was not more weight. What I needed was permission to live. And so I began, slowly, to give myself that permission, to enjoy a meal without rushing, to call a friend not because I had to, but because I wanted to take a walk with no destination, only curiosity, to sit on the porch and watch the world go by, without guilt. These were small steps, but they were steps back toward life, toward laughter, toward freedom. As I reflect now, I see that the first step in not taking life too seriously is not about ignoring responsibilities. It is about remembering balance. Responsibilities will always exist, but so will the chance to breathe, to smile, to notice beauty. And when you begin to see that, something shifts. The day feels less like a burden. The future feels less like a race. You begin to hear the music of life again. And for the first time in years, you might even feel like dancing. As I continued to shift my perspective, I began to notice how much of life I had missed while chasing goals. It was not only the big moments that slipped by, but the small and ordinary ones. I had been so focused on proving myself that I forgot to look around. One weekend, I decided to take a walk through the local park. The air was cool, the kind of crisp air that makes you breathe deeper without even trying. Families were sitting on blankets. The kids were throwing frisbees. The couples were holding hands. None of them seemed in a hurry. They were simply there, enjoying the day. I realized that for years I had walked through similar parks with my mind already planning Monday morning. I had been present in body but absent in spirit. That afternoon I sat on a bench and let myself watch. For the first time in a long while, I felt part of something bigger. Not because I had earned it, but because I was willing to notice it. That was when it struck me. Life was never asking me to take it so seriously. Life was asking me to join in. The more I opened my eyes, the more I saw it. The neighbor who whistled while mowing his lawn, the old man at the diner, who always ordered pie with a smile, no matter the weather. The sound of laughter from the high school baseball field drifting into the night. These were not distractions from life. They were life. And yet for years I had dismissed them as unimportant. It is easy to believe that seriousness equals importance. We convince ourselves that our struggles matter more if we frown while carrying them. But what if the opposite is true? What if the lightness of play, the willingness to laugh, the ability to see beauty in small things is actually the deeper wisdom I thought about music? No one listens to a symphony only for the final note. We listen for the journey. The crescendos, the silences, the unexpected turns. The same is true with a dance. No one dances to arrive at a certain spot on the floor. We dance because each step, each movement, carries its own joy. That realization became the turning point. Life is not a problem to be solved or a finish line to cross. Life is a song. Life is a dance. And once you see it that way, everything changes. At first, I resisted this idea. A part of me still wanted control. I had built my identity around being serious, responsible, always in charge. Letting go felt risky. It felt childish, even foolish. But then I remembered something. Children laugh hundreds of times a day. Adults often go hours without a single laugh. Who is truly foolish? The child who knows how to find joy in the ordinary, or the adult who has forgotten? The thought made me smile. And in that smile, I found a little more freedom. One evening, I visited a local community center. They were hosting a dance night for seniors and families. At first, I stood against the wall, watching. People of every age were on the floor. Some moved gracefully, others clumsily, but all of them were smiling. No one was competing. No one was worried about how they looked. The music filled the room, and together they moved. I hesitated for a moment, and then stepped onto the floor. My movements were awkward, my rhythm uncertain, but then something happened. The laughter around me softened my self-consciousness. The music pulled me along. Within minutes, I forgot to be serious. I was just moving, enjoying, living. That night became a lesson I never forgot. Dancing was not about being the best. It was about being present. And so is life. The more I allowed myself to see life as a dance, the more the pressure lifted. A dinner with my grown children did not have to be perfect. It was enough to hear their voices, to share a meal, to laugh at old stories. A conversation with a friend did not have to solve the world's problems. It was enough to sit together, sip coffee, and let words wander. Even doing the dishes after a meal became lighter when I realized the water, the warmth. The simple act of cleaning could be its own rhythm. Life was no longer a burden I had to carry. It was a dance I was invited to join. And yet, I noticed something else too. When I stopped being so serious, the people around me began to relax as well. My children, once worried about my constant stress, started to open up more. Friends lingered longer in conversation. Even strangers seemed drawn to a smile instead of a frown. By letting go of my own seriousness, I gave others permission to do the same. That is the beauty of lightness. It spreads. I used to believe that if I was not serious, I was not responsible. But living with more ease did not mean abandoning responsibility. It meant carrying it differently. It meant cooking dinner with music playing in the background instead of silence. It meant paying bills on time but not letting them steal my peace. It meant finishing my work while still making time to watch the sunset. There is a balance between responsibility and joy. And for the first time, I was learning how to find it. One night I wrote in my journal, "Life is not about winning or losing. It is about dancing while the music lasts." Writing those words made me pause. They felt true in a way that seriousness never had. As I closed the journal and looked around my quiet home, I realized something. The silence was no longer heavy. It no longer pressed down on me. It felt open, spacious, alive. It was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of possibility. That was when I knew. The seriousness that once defined me was slipping away. In its place was something softer, lighter, but far stronger. A new way of being. And for the first time in many years, I felt free. There comes a moment when you realize that the weight you carried for so long was never truly required. That moment often comes quietly. Not with fireworks, but with a deep breath you did not know you were holding. For me, it came one morning when I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. The sky was pale blue. The trees swayed gently. And a bird landed on the railing just a few feet away. It sang without hesitation. I remember thinking, this bird does not worry about tomorrow. It does not take its life too seriously. It simply sings. That small moment stayed with me. It taught me that freedom is not found in doing more, but in being present enough to notice what already is. The bird had no grand plan, no schedule, no heavy ambition. Yet in its simple song, there was joy. I realized then that I wanted to live more like that. Of course, life still asks things of us. There are bills to pay, families to support, and responsibilities to uphold. But seriousness is not the same as responsibility. You can fulfill your duties while keeping your spirit light. You can meet obligations while still allowing space for laughter and rest. I learned to bring playfulness back into my daily life. Washing the dishes with music playing softly in the background. Taking a walk and allowing myself to wander down a street I had never taken before. Talking to a stranger in line at the grocery store. Not because I had to, but because I could. Each of these small acts reminded me that life was not something to conquer. It was something to join. There were times when I stumbled back into old habits. I caught myself worrying about the future, holding my jaw tight, rushing through moments as if the next one would be more valuable. But then I would stop, breathe, and remember, the music is now, the dance is here. The older I grew, the clearer it became. Seriousness often comes from fear. Fear of failure, fear of looking foolish, fear of losing control. But when you let go of that fear, you begin to see the beauty in imperfection. You begin to see that laughter in the middle of a mistake is often more precious than success without joy. One evening I visited a local diner. I sat at the counter, and an older man next to me ordered pie with a grin. He looked at me and said, "What is the point of living if you can't enjoy dessert?" His words made me laugh. But later I realized he was right. Too often, we deny ourselves small pleasures in the name of being serious. Yet those small pleasures are the threads that weave a life worth remembering. When I look back, I do not recall the meetings or the deadlines with pride. What I recall are the dinners filled with laughter, from the trips where nothing went as planned, but everything became a story. The mornings when the sunrise caught me by surprise. These are the memories that shine. These are the moments that prove life was never meant to be endured, but to be embraced. If I could speak to my younger self, I would tell him this: do not waste your days trying to win life. Do not carry it like a burden that must be managed. Instead, open your hands. Let the music in. Laugh more often. Rest more deeply. Allow yourself to be imperfect, because imperfection is where joy often hides. The truth is, life is not waiting for us to finish our lists. Life is happening now. It is in the sound of your grandchild's laughter. It is in the warmth of your partner's hand. It is in the quiet of a walk under the stars. If you are always serious, you will miss it. But if you are willing to let go, even for a moment, you will find that the music was playing all along. Sometimes I think of life as a great play, a stage where each of us takes a role. For years I played mine with too much weight, believing the role was real. Now I see it differently. The stage is still there. The role still matters. But the play is just that. A play. When you remember that, you can perform with more freedom, more honesty, and more joy. The resolution is simple, but it took me a lifetime to understand. Life was never meant to be taken too seriously. It was meant to be lived, to be danced, to be sung. And the measure of a good life is not how heavy the burden was, but how freely you moved with it. So if you are listening to this, I want to leave you with a question. When was the last time you let yourself laugh without reason? When was the last time you allowed yourself to be carried by the music of the moment, if it has been too long? Maybe today is the day to begin again. Tonight, when the world grows quiet, do not fill the silence with worry. Sit with it. Listen. Maybe turn on a favorite song and let yourself sway, even if no one is watching. Remember, you do not need permission to enjoy life. You already have it. And in the end, when you look back, you will see that the richest moments were never the ones where you carried life with solemn seriousness. They were the ones where you set the weight down, smiled, and joined the dance.